pulling folks in as they join. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for our wonderful presenter today and also time for any dialogue or community that might happen at the end of the call. Welcome to our Hispanic Heritage Month presentation today. I'm very delighted to be bringing in Dr. Anna Nogar, for a presentation that is bringing our two campuses together as well. We have some folks here who are on our main campus, or maybe even some of our satellite campuses, and also our North Health Sciences campus. And one of the biggest things that I've really enjoyed about being involved in our Heritage Months presentations from the HSC side of the diversity world is an opportunity to really highlight this broader community of colleagues that we have. I think that as simple as it is to be so closely located, there still always seems to be a divide, and trying to make sure that we're really bringing our communities together to celebrate these Heritage Months has been one of my favorite parts of my job. I am going to go ahead and introduce our speaker and have us turn it over and be able to have our wonderful talk. Okay, so today we have a presentation titled Public Humanities Explorations, Recovering Silence Voices of the Southwest, which will be presented by Dr. Anna Nogar. Dr. Nogar is a professor of Hispanic Southwest Studies in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. Her research specializations include Nuevomexicano writing and culture, colonial Mexican literature, Mexican American cultural and literary studies, and community oral history. She currently serves as the Associate Dean for Humanities and Interdisciplinary Units in the College of Arts and Sciences. She co-authored the prize-winning scholarly edition El Feliz Ingenio Neo-Mexicano, Felipe M. Chacon, and Poesía y Prosa. I'm hoping I'm really practicing my early Spanish skills. An expert on the 17th century Spanish nun Maria de Jesus de Agreda, Dr. Nogar authored Quill and Cross in the Borderlands, Maria de Agreda and the Lady in Blue from 1628 to the present, a prize-winning cross-disciplinary study of nearly 400 years of history, literature, and folklore concerning the nun. Nogar co-authored the prize-winning bilingual young readers book, Sisters in Blue, Hermanas de Azul, which interprets Maria de Agreda's travels for a youth audience. Dr. Nogar's expertise on colonial Mexican and borderlands literatures is reflected in a triptych of volumes. That is a new word, Kendra. That comprehensively examines Mexican literature. Nogar published a history of Mexican literature named Outstanding Academic Title in 2017 by the American Library Association, a history of Mexican poetry, and the forthcoming A History of the Mexican Novel. She also published colonial itineraries of contemporary Mexico literary and cultural inquiries. She engages in literary recovery work as a member of the board of directors of the Recovering the U.S. Hispanic Literary Heritage Project. That is a fantastic CV, amazing work and contributions, and really expansive. And I am very much looking forward to this talk. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Nogar.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Lindsay. Thank you, Kendra, for all your help in setting up this talk and letting people know when it's happening and where. I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to present some research relating to Hispanic Heritage Month and to, as you said, Lindsay, connect the North Campus with the main campus and have this conversation. And thank you. I've seen so many people who are participating in this talk. I can't see everybody at once, but it's really nice to see your faces here in Virtualandia. And I hope you enjoy the presentation. So as many of you know, I work on a lot of different topics relating to Spanish language voices, Hispanic cultures in the borderlands, and in New Mexico specifically. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about how we make these voices visible. We pull them out of the archives. We make them into things that are different than how they've been understood in the past. Because that's fundamentally one of the things that we do as humanities scholars, and connecting with the communities that we live in, which is another fundamental part of what we do as humanistic researchers and people who are interested in what people have done over time. So let me see if I can manage this here. Okay. So one of the things that I seek to do through the 3 projects I'm going to share with you today is to locate individuals, narratives, and histories that have been lost, or whose stories have been sort of told incompletely or from a limiting perspective. Oops, am I still screen sharing? Okay, just wanted to make sure.
Yep, you're good.
Okay. And then to rethink as well what the archive reveals, what it hides, and sometimes the archive, we think things are living there, and because it lives there, that makes them visible or legible, and that's not always the case. So we can start to ask ourselves why that's the case, how that's the case. We can start to be thinking about communities of reading, which is a little bit different than thinking about the items themselves. So rather than thinking about something that was written, or perhaps the life of somebody in a particular place, we can think instead maybe about who was reading the things this person wrote or circulated, why they're reading it, how it becomes accessible to them, why it's not accessible to other folks. So identifying communities of reading, who's talking about the things that are written, the things that we find in the archive in their time and later. And then to continually revisit research subjects. As you'll see in my first project on María de Jesús de Ágreda, I started working on that project as an undergraduate at the University of New Mexico many years ago. And then it became a master's thesis project, a PhD dissertation, this book, a children's book, a bilingual young readers book, and then many other articles. And I'll talk a little bit about that. I think, when you work on some of these subjects over a lengthy period of time, you really get to know them, and you have a chance to revisit them and see them in a new light, or see some possibilities beyond what was maybe originally visible. And then the last piece, which is so super duper important, is connecting with the public. So, we work on these projects. If you're a humanistic researcher, you're often working alone. Maybe you're going to conferences and you're talking with your colleagues and you're working through some of these ideas in a particular environment. But when you can share this work with other folks, take it into public forums, give talks like this one today, or places like the National Hispanic Cultural Center, or any of the public libraries we have throughout the state and the city, it's an opportunity to really share and make this work tangible for everybody. And in my experience with many of these projects, through these conversations, folks who come to the talks or people who have read about the research are really excited to share their knowledge about these topics with me and share sources as well. As you'll see shortly, the image that forms the front of Quill and Cross in the Borderlands, this book, is from the former St. Catherine's Indian School in Santa Fe. And I didn't know that this mural that featured my subject was there until I did a live presentation about this material. And during that time, I found out that this image existed, and I went to take pictures and found a whole lot more about it, as you'll see shortly. So this is really one of the most exciting things we do as humanistic researchers, is to share with everybody, share with the public. So today I'm going to talk about 3 subjects, 3 individuals, their works, how they're read in their time and afterwards, that I've worked on for quite some time. The first is a 17th century nun, María de Jesús de Ágreda, who was alleged to have bilocated to New Mexico in the 17th century. The second is a late 19th century, early 20th century Nuevomexicano poet, Felipe Chacón, and it's his works that are in El Feliz Ingenio Neo-Mexicano. And then the last one is a project I'm working on right now, on a Nuevo-Mexicana folklorist, Aurora Lucero White-Lee, who lived in the late 19th and through the later 20th century, who started her life as a treaty citizen. That is somebody who was a was a not fully enfranchised citizen of the United States when New Mexico was a treaty, and who did a number of interesting things through her work collecting folklore, teaching in bilingual settings, advocating for Pan-Americanism at a time when that was really important in terms of how New Mexico was going to be understood. New Mexico and its people were going to be understood outside of the state, and as policies were being crafted within the state to sort of govern how teaching worked and how law functioned in New Mexico. So first, I'm going to talk about my good friend, Maria de Jesus de Agreda. She's kept me company now for over 20 years. These are some of the pieces I've worked on over the years. Quill and Cross in the Borderlands is the primary scholarly study. Sisters in Blue, Hermanas de Azul, which was illustrated by the Pura Belpré award-winning artist Amy Cordova, which is a young reader's book that also has a scholarly essay at the end, a bilingual young reader's book with a scholarly essay at the end that we hope teaches that teaches through the book itself. And then some other things, a history of Mexican literature. This is some other edited volumes in which I talk about Maria de Jesus de Agreda. And why do I talk about her so much, aside from she's my longtime friend in this scholarly context? It's because it's because there's a lot of questions, I think, and in particularly in the case of Maria de Jesus de Agreda, I think contemplating the idea of recovering and rewriting established historical narratives is really fundamental to understanding her and understanding her place in the borderlands in New Mexico, and kind of giving greater agency and visibility, especially to female figures from the past. Now, this is a detail of the mural but painted by Edward O'Brien, and you can see here, there's an idea of her as somebody who bilocates, as in her body, as you can see, her remains in her convent in Spain, and her spirit or something of that nature travels to New Mexico ahead of Franciscan missionaries. So later on, you'll see the word proto-missionary. All that means is a missionary who comes to a place before actual missionaries, and that's how she's sort of described in the 17th century. So this was the sort of fixed idea about her, that she was a mystic, that there's this kind of unusual story about her traveling to New Mexico in this fashion in the 1600s. And that is kind of where historiography froze on her in the early 20th century, and not a whole lot more had been done. There's this, mysticism is always viewed in a certain way. It's frequently linked to women and not to men, although that was not the case at her time, but it's how she kind of becomes to be understood. And you can see here in this printing that was made in Mexico in 1730, that this was the idea about her that was sort of promulgated. One of the ideas that was sort of promulgated, that was spread about her, was her as a mystical missionary traveling to New Mexico. And this is great. This is a piece from the John Carter Brown Library at Brown University. They have an amazing collection of early American images, and this is one of the early American images that they have in their collection, showing her in this really specific mode that the more I researched it, didn't really seem to tell the whole story. And the reason it didn't tell the whole story is because she was known also as an author of a mystical text called The Mystical City of God, La Mística Ciudad de Dios, which is an autobiography of the Virgin Mary as dictated to Sor María de Jesus de Agreda. And this is a picture of a painting that exists in her convent. She was a cloistered Spanish nun who lived out her life cloistered, which means she didn't leave her convent in Spain. And this painting exists in her convent in Spain. And you can see the main event, sort of like a saint's life that's written as painting. So the main event, the biggest piece of her biography, is this scene in the middle where she's writing, she's hearing the dictation of the biography of the Virgin Mary, and she's writing it down. And then all around here, there's 16 little vignettes, little pictures of other aspects of her life. And you can see right there at the top, there's a couple of images of her traveling to New Mexico in advance of Franciscan friars, and then Franciscan friars following up. So this got me thinking, there has to be something more than this story that I've heard, that this narrative that I've heard and that I've read and that has been studied. There has to be more to it. And indeed, the more I looked, I found that the piece about her as a writer and the reach of her intellectual impact in Spain, in Mexico, here in New Mexico, in California, in the borderlands, was as important as the narrative of her bilocation, which was also very important in its time and later. So in the book, I say, what I'm trying to do here is show both parts of this story. The material legacy of a legend that has survived and thrived for hundreds of years. Indeed, there are contemporary books, fiction, plays, dance operas, other sorts of productive forms, puppet shows that present the idea of her as somebody who mystically traveled. But then the other part is rediscovering the writing, that went right along with that. They went hand in hand. So it's sort of two sides of the same coin. And that was such a fascinating project. I sometimes say that it feels, every time you go to an archive, every time you visit a collection, it's just this thrilling experience where you don't know exactly what you're going to find, even if you think you do when you get there. And you have the opportunity to just see what's there and to start to merge these pieces together to find what sort of story is really present. And so one of the things that I found was this amazing piece of artwork from, it's right now at the Museo del Virreinato in Tepoztlán. It was actually here in New Mexico this past year, starting last fall, as part of the Saints and Santos exhibit that was at the New Mexico Museum of Art in Santa Fe. And it's super cool. This is a colonial era painting that sort of illustrates the thesis that I'm trying to explain, which is she's a writer, and then at the top it says María de Jesús de edad de 20, it says María de Jesús de Agreda, at 20 years old, traveled to preach in New Mexico. So in this image, we have this fusing of these two ideas, right? Even if you maybe weren't literate, you could see this image at the time, right, in the 1700s when it was painted, and understand the concept behind it, that there's this individual who's both a writer and a traveler. And so that really was important in thinking through what this could mean. Like, what are the ways people knew her as a writer in her time and later? One of them is through this book called The Mystical City of God, as I mentioned before, which is the biography of the Virgin Mary. But in that book, there's a number of other things that are happening. There are exegetic episodes of the Bible that are described. There are descriptions of other individuals in biblical history that appear in this text, and we're going to talk about those in just a second. She is also put forward for sainthood. So there's this fascinating play that was published in two parts in 1736. It's called La Coronista Más Grande, and this is sort of what I'm working on right now. I've got an article coming out about this, in fact, very shortly. And in this play, which is a type of play called the Comedia de Santos, which would be the type of play that a playwright would create to advance the canonization of a religious figure, or to sort of increase devotion to somebody who is already a saint. And in this play, which I'm pretty sure was never performed because it's very complicated, and there's no evidence that it was performed, there's the intersection of her biography, which is kind of what you would expect to see, and then all of these scenes, they're called tramoyas, where bits and pieces of the mystical city of God get staged, right? So all these scenes about Christmas, about various episodes in the lives of these biblical figures get staged as part of this play. So it's this fascinating hybrid text that shows a little bit about how people wanted to understand her, were being guided to understand her in her time. And you can see, this is early 1700s. So this is published in Mexico, in Spain rather, but it gives us an idea of how readers at the time, right, what the community of reading of her at the time was kind of intended to take from their reading. And as I said, there's plenty of scenes from the mystical city of God. This is a picture of her saint's life that was also published both as part of her big book. This mystical city of God was like 3 big fat tomes. And it had as its preface her biography. So this is a picture of her biography, which was also published separately. So these are sort of the source materials for this play. And the play talks about specific scenes from the lives of these biblical figures, including the play describes the circumcision of Christ, which is one of the things that is described in Sor Maria's The Mystical City of God. This is a painting from a Mexican collection. that currently resides in Puebla, but it's a very unique idea that is expressed in a particular way in her writing, and it's very interesting to see it show up in plays. It's interesting to see similar concepts show up in artwork of colonial Mexico. All of this tells us that people were exposed to, read, understood her writing, right? This is not somebody whose works lived in an archive somewhere or in a repository that nobody could find them. They were things that circulated because we can see how they show up in these very public facing pieces of art, plays, other types of publications, such as this publication. This is a publication called, it's a Septenario, which is a 7-day prayer that was published in Mexico 7 times in Mexico, 5 printings in Mexico City and 1 in Puebla. And I bring this up because it's one example of many, many publications that were created in Mexico, Mexico City, Puebla, Guatemala, various other sites in Mexico that reprint parts of her writing. Right? And nobody had thought previously to look at this and say, okay, these little guides, they're little folletines, which are little packets, reading packets, these devotional packets. The extent to which they were reprinted, the extent to which they cite her writing and then put it into action, as in this 7-day prayer. And then furthermore, the extent to which people really were aware of and continue to engage in these practices. When you see something published this many times over and over again, that means there's a continuing engagement with it going on. And when we think about women writers of this time period, there are very, very, very few whose writing achieved this kind of popular circulation. So that's another thing to consider here. This is also forthcoming in this next article. And it has to do with something that was written in the Mystical City of God, as it says here. It's about these 7 privileges that were granted to Saint Joseph. One of which, so this devotion is a devotion to Saint Joseph on the basis of things that were written in the Mystical City of God about him. So this particular printing of this Septenario was done in 1785, and it was commissioned by the Oratorians of the Congregation of San Felipe de Neri in Mexico City. And the interesting thing about the Oratorians is they had little street side areas, open areas, where they would preach in the street. And so something like the publishing of this document by them suggests that it was meant to be spoken, was meant to be shared with the public, and that you wouldn't even necessarily have to be able to read to be able to have been exposed to these ideas and to this writing. And so this is another fascinating idea. When we think about communities of reading, we can think about communities of hearing, we can think about communities of experience, we can think about different ways, different modes of exposure, right? Different ways by which people get close to writing or receive ideas. And this is one example where we can see something in print, but we know it was used for speech, right? We know it was used in a public forum. So the Septenario talks about these 7 privileges. One of the privileges has to do with providing a good death, a happy transition. And so this novena, which is also taken from the Mystical City of God, just focuses on that one piece, which has to do with, people's worry, their anxiety about what happens when they pass away, when they're on the precipice of passing away. And so this novena, which was published in Mexico City, it was published in Puebla de Los Angeles, it was also published in Guatemala. Again, is another place where we see people putting ideas from Maria de Jesus's writing into real practice and over a lengthy period of time. There's other examples of times when it was reprinted, right? So it's something that people were interested in, they're engaging with, and it gets reprinted and people are using it, right? So people are really steeped in the ideas that are presented through her writing, right? So this was actually from a little chapel from the Cathedral Basilica of St. Augustine in St. Augustine, Florida. I happened to be there for a conference. I checked out this little chapel, and there was this very scene of the death of Saint Joseph that is reflective of the ideas in the mystical city of God. Not to say that it's exactly the same, but it's featured as part of the concept of who he is, like how he's popularly known. So this is another interesting way in which what people do and what they think connects with this writing in a very concrete way. And I mentioned the exhibit that happened this past fall or this past year at the New Mexico Museum of Art, the Saints and Santos exhibit. In it, they had this really cool reliquary. A reliquary is a devotional object that features elements that relate to the devotional figure. So in this case, on the top, you can see it says sangre. That is below that is a dot of blood from the devotional figure, and there's his bones and other, the veil and other pieces that form part of this reliquary object. And it's really interesting to see this devotional object existing in Mexico when previous studies hadn't really connected her, Maria de Agreda, as a devotional figure there, and here in New Mexico as well. This is another example of a very cool piece of colonial art that depicts her as a writer. And this was also part of the exhibit that was just here this past fall, and I contributed an article on all this to the Saints and Santos catalog, but that describes how people in colonial Mexico, which of course would have included New Mexico at the time, sort of thought about her and saw representations of her writing, right? Who she was as a writer. Let's see. And I keep working on it. Things keep finding their way to me. A poem written in Tamil from the late 1600s in India, for example, that is based on her writing. This is another example of some artwork from a Mexican painter that has surfaced recently at Christie's auction house, talking about engaging outside of the strictly academic fields. I'm always sort of looking for, and things seem to find me that relate to her in Mexico, in New Mexico, in the Southwest and beyond. So it's an ongoing project. I thoroughly enjoy researching it because it's for many reasons. One of the reasons is that it's such an interesting process to unfold. All right, let's move and change directions here. Just a moment to shake it out. The next person I want to talk about, next subject is Felipe Chacon. Felipe Maximiliano Chacon was a periodiquero, a New Mexican newspaper editor from the early 20th, late 19th century. He was the editor of La Bandera Americana, which was published here in Albuquerque. One of many Spanish language newspapers that was published in New Mexico from the middle of the 19th century till the early 20th century. His book, Obras de Felipe M. Chacón, El Cantor Neomexicano, Poesía y Prosa, is the first book of published poetry by a Mexican American. It was published here in New Mexico in 1924. And that is one of the features of El Feliz Ingenio Neomexicano is the complete transcription and translation of his poetry into English, as well as introduction and notes to provide a lot of context for these poems, which we're going to see here in just a second. Chacon was from a family of Nuevomexicano writers who wrote in Spanish and English and who were living at a time of great transition in New Mexico when New Mexico became a territory in 1846, 1848, and then experienced this period as a territory until 1912, and then the early years of statehood for New Mexico. And one of the things that's so fascinating about studying him is to see how rich the conversation was in Spanish here in New Mexico about what the fate of the territory would be, what would be the effect on language, what would be the effect on public schools, how would the vote work here in New Mexico, for example. And Felipe Chacon, because of his family's longtime involvement and in publishing and writing and in participating in governance, was right at the fore of all these conversations. He wrote editorials. He, as I said, edited newspapers. So he was very aware of the type of political and social conversations that were occurring at the time that he was writing his poetry. His cousins, Felipe Chacon, who we have Francisco Lomelí and Gabriel Melendez recently published a book, a compilation of Felipe M. Chacon's writing. And they were all sort of involved in a project that Gabriel Melendez has called like Una Literatura Nacional Nuevomexicana, the idea of an autochthonous literature for New Mexico that would describe its own, the experience of the people here and in Spanish in a way that was consistent with their historical understanding of themselves and their context. So in the introduction to the prologue of Poesía y Prosa, Benjamin Reed, another author of the time who wrote an illustrated, I think it's Historia Ilustrada de Nuevo Mexico, provided this really interesting and maybe slightly prophetic comment in the prologue. And I'll read the translation here. I do not doubt that in the course of time's passage, the literary works of Felipe Maximiliano Chacon are destined to leave as their footprint a distinct epoch in the literary history of the United States of America. And I think you'll see really quickly what sort of prognostication that was. So this is a picture of Felipe Chacon that was included from Poesía y Prosa. It was announced in the newspaper. You could buy your paper copy in addition to your newspaper if you wanted. And then, of course, some of the poems that he put together in Poesía y Prosa had also been published in the newspaper, as we'll see shortly, with the poem that he wrote in support of Adelina Nino Otero Warren's candidacy for Congress. So he's really interested in questions relating to politics, relating to their moment in New Mexico. And this is a poem, a section of a poem called A Nuevo Mexico, which is written in 1911, which is just before New Mexico becomes a state. And he's writing in this elevated form. He's writing in a way that clearly shows that his points of literary reference are both the US, of course, but of course, Mexico and Latin America, because these are the literary currents that were coming through New Mexico prior to becoming a territory and even after New Mexico was a territory. Right? So we see him invoking a lot of the same forms. We see him in dialogue with Latin American writers of the time and Spanish writers of the time, because those were the literary models that they were receiving. He also does an amazing job of he includes like 8 or 9 translations from English into Spanish of British and American poets like Dryden, Longfellow, George Gordon, Lord Byron, where he renders the English poem into Spanish. And it's very difficult to do. And it shows his mastery of the 2 languages, complete mastery of the 2 languages. Poetic translation, as we discovered in working on this book, or at least I discovered, it was my first experience doing a translation project of this type. It's very complicated, especially when you're working with poetry, where it's form, it's feeling, it's rhyme, and it's rhythm, and there's lots of pieces that go into place into it. So he himself in his moment was showing his skill, his bilingual skills, and we tried to reflect that in the book. So this is a poem that references New Mexico's late entry as a state after many years as a territory. And then here we have 2 political poems, Mi Escogido y Mis Razones, which was dedicated to gubernatorial candidate Octaviano Larrazolo. And then on the right, we see a poem to a la señora Adelina Otero Warren, candidata republicana para el Congreso 1922, which is an advocacy for Nina Otero Warren in her candidacy to run for Congress. Now, if we roll our minds back to 2020, that was the centenary of women's right to vote, of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. So for that to become an amendment to the Constitution, each state needed to approve the amendment to the Constitution, or a certain percentage of the states needed to approve the amendment to the Constitution. And Nina Otero Warren was very active in the suffrage movement in New Mexico and advocating for the state legislature to approve that amendment to the Constitution, and then very shortly thereafter amend the New Mexico State Constitution to allow women to run for office. So she was involved in those efforts and then immediately ran for office herself. One of a handful of women across the nation who was doing that, the first Latina to run for Congress across the US. And here we see Felipe Chacon's poem, which was published in La Bandera Americana. And we saw this little snippet here where he says, "The world advances and so too human thought, and new things into this life are born. Today reflects the morning light of a new dawn into which women are born." It's a very supportive poem advancing her candidacy to Congress. She did not win her bid, but she went on to do many other things, including compile folklore, work, be elected and appointed positions within state government. She's a very interesting person, but here's her poem. It was published in 1923. That's a facsimile. It was published prior as well in La Bandera Americana. And then I'm just going to share a couple more examples here of really wonderful poems that he wrote that are in Poesía y Prosa, and therefore in El Feliz Ingenio Neomexicano, that speak to, in this case, the New Mexico state legislators, and kind of a call to action, a call to vision in their role as newly minted state legislators, because there was, until New Mexico was a state, there weren't state legislators, there were territorial officials. You are aware of what this obligation demands, and know that in this life, he or she who fills a promise rises up, and the pride of his descendants will never die. So this is sort of a call to action for the new New Mexico state legislators. And then here is another poem called A Nuevo México en su admisión como Estado. So again, marking New Mexico's admission as a state into the US. And he references a lot of the sort of acrimonious conversations that had taken place prior to New Mexico's admission as a state in this poem. And here's an example of that. And finally, this is also in the prologue. I tend to think of him, not only of Felipe Chacon, not only as el feliz ingenio neomexicano, pero el conciudadano bilingüe. Right? This is a great term that Benjamin Reed coins in this, or uses anyway, in this introduction. He says, "In my humble opinion, the United States should be proud of having produced a fellow citizen who offers up glowing praise for his homeland through the talent of his literary production in the language of those kings, the Catholic kings," and here he's referring to the kings of Spain, "who so notably contributed to the discovery of America, the continent we inhabit." So this is the way Benjamin Reed expresses the idea that his bilingualism should be something that's valued, that as a con-citizen of the United States, this is a valuable contribution to what it is to be an American. And that fits in very well with the final project I'll talk about, and I won't take quite as long this time, which is a biobibliography of Aurora Lucero White-Lee, who's sort of a contemporary, maybe a little bit more contemporary than Felipe Chacon, who worked on collecting literary folklore of the Hispanic Southwest. This is one of the books that she published, who worked as well as an agent for Pan-Americanism during the early 20th century. She was a translator for the Pan American Scientific Congress on the East Coast. On the West Coast, she participated in the Pan-Panamanian Congress that happened in San Diego in Balboa Park. In fact, one of the buildings that still stands in Balboa Park is modeled after, I believe it's the church in Acoma Pueblo. So she is one of the figures who at the time is advocating for Nuevomexicano identity, for bilingualism, as part of a larger vision of how New Mexico and its citizens fit within the hemisphere, like as United States citizens, but what they offer, what their bilingualism, what their cultural knowledge offers, as part of that pluralistic view of what the United States could be. And so there are many facets. She was also a suffragette. She worked to advance the 19th Amendment. She's a very interesting figure. Her father, Antonio Lucero, was the first Secretary of State for New Mexico, and also had a newspaper in Las Vegas, New Mexico, and La Voz del Pueblo. And so she also, from a very early age, grew up in a context in which she was very aware of political conversations, very aware of the goings-on in the place where she lived. In 1911, she presented a talk as part of like an oratorical competition, and It was called Shall the Spanish Language Be Taught in the Schools of New Mexico? Although it was popularly circulated in the Spanish language press as Defensa de Nuestro Idioma, and you might catch there's a little bit of a difference in how those two titles are presented. And you'll also note the date, which is 1911, so just before New Mexico becomes a state in 1912, and one of the proposals in the offing at that time had to do with the teaching of Spanish and English in public schools. And in this Defensa de Nuestro Idioma, she makes an argument for the continued teaching of Spanish and English with the same intensity in the public schools of New Mexico. We have taught this, we've used this historical document in our teaching of heritage language because it provides some rich context for Spanish taught here in New Mexico, and kind of gives us a sense of historical trajectory. So this is when she was still, I think she was in high school at this point, or maybe a bachelor's degree. It's an image of her from her debutante period. She was also in the society pages, so there's interesting information about what she was up to socially. Historical picture of Highlands University. She also got 2 degrees. She finished her master's degree, I think it was through Highlands, and became a professor at Highlands University. And then she started going into the field and collecting Nuevomexicano folklore with her students, going to the small towns around New Mexico and collecting folklore. As a result, she began working with the Works Progress Administration, and this is an archival photo from the Palace of the Governors in Santa Fe, showing her working. She's the one seated in the middle in the white coat, working with the WPA and their project to collect regional lore. And although the WPA's book did not feature much of the lore that she collected, her archive is still available. And I think out of that experience, she decided perhaps it was a good idea for her to start publishing her own books. So she started publishing books on folk dances. This came out in 2 different editions. Folk plays. This is Coloquios de los Pastores. So the Pastorela play, the Christmas time play that's still performed here and other places in the Hispanophone world. You can see she's published that in 1940, 1937, 1940. She continues publishing more and more books, Teacher's Guide. She was elected the Assistant Superintendent of Schools as well. So she was in the classroom teaching. She wrote a textbook that is based on Pan-American principles, which I didn't include here. And so she's a fascinating person who has many different illustrative and interesting aspects of their history and of what they wrote. And so it's been exciting to bring these forward. It's been exciting to see people engaging in the folk dances that she documents in this book now in the present day. And I'm really grateful to my colleagues who have shared some of these examples with me, especially Carmela Scorcha Pacheco, I think is in the audience. I'm very appreciative for seeing the connection very clearly from the moment when she's documenting these dances and their continued practice today. And here I'm talking a little bit about some of the places where we start doing research. I've been really fortunate to work with the support of the Mellon Humanities Now grant that we had here at UNM, with the Assure project from the College of Arts and Sciences, with the Crossing Latinidades Mellon grant, and recently, with the National Endowment for the Humanities Faculty Award. I'm really grateful for your attention. I'd love to give some time here for questions, and I'm going to go ahead and turn off the sharing.
Thank you, Anna. That was wonderful. I will go ahead and just turn it over. If people have questions, comments, we've got flying hands going all over the screen. Yeah. But please do, if you have something to add, unmute and join in the conversation. I have a question about, oh, go ahead, Gabby.
So, hi, Anna. So I would like to know a little bit more about Aurora Lucero White, exactly what kind of stories she recollected and what they were important in the time she did it?
Thank you for the question, Gabi. I'm still working on this part of this proposed book. But it's been interesting to look at what appears in the newspapers, how things are described. So what people understood to be happening, both in the Spanish language press and in the English language press, to see what doesn't make it into the book about New Mexico that the WPA produces. And then to see that immediately, she starts publishing her own works. And to know that of the materials from that WPA collection that are still accessible, in fact, we have a facsimile of some of the materials from the WPA collection here at Zimmerman Library and the Center for Southwest Research, those are more frequently consulted. So I think at the time there was, she was engaged in this desire to preserve and perpetuate folk forms, community interactions, music, ways of knowing that she felt that were perhaps going to either disappear or be devalued, because that's, I think, was what she saw in her experience with the WPA, was that it wasn't valued in the way that she felt very strongly it could be valued. And so she went down this other path. And it's fascinating. As I mentioned, I'm working right now on a piece. Oh, I also worked with the U.S. Latino Digital Humanities Project through the Recovering the U.S. Hispanic Literary Heritage Project to create a digital timeline with Dominique Rodriguez, PhD candidate. And one of the neat things about that timeline is that we can show this piece about dancing, which is, we can look at the archive and we can say, oh, it's so cool. Here it is. It's documented. There's all sorts of facets that are interesting about how these dances were documented. But then to see them, right, to see people embodying what that is and to show that they understand how dances work. Right. It's not like we're just going to the club and everybody's like, I don't know, doing whatever people do in the clubs. I'm not even going to try. But where it's like a sort of free form situation, these were very prescripted dance steps with understandings that, like, when you hear the music, that cues a certain sort of behavior, whether you're dancing in a group of 2, a group of 4, a group of 8, or you're a big group and then you go back into pairs. That's sort of like a shared knowledge that a community has. And so seeing that she both sought to preserve that and then seeing how now that continues is amazing. And in the timeline format, you can see it, right? Because you can both observe the progression of the idea and then look at what's happening now.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna.
Francisco, you are up.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for bringing these historical figures and voices to the forefront. My question is there a list, like a compilation of these voices, historical figures in New Mexico, New Mexico, right? That could be shared, and I'm saying this could be integrated in high school courses, like language courses, college courses, so that people could be more aware of, the amazing people that were here and the influence that they had. And I think it could also be tied to a history course and also the contemporary issues, right? Like the Martinez Yasi lawsuit and how to support the importance of bilingualism in the state of New Mexico based on what the Constitution states. So I'm just curious about that. Thank you.
That's a wonderful question. I don't know. I couldn't point directly to a resource that exists. Well, there are some compilations, there are historical, there are sort of syntheses of these. And if I try to pull up the titles right now, I will definitely not remember them correctly. But it does get my wheels turning for thinking on the curriculum side of this type of research. Like, how could these figures be explained? And in fact, I mentioned Tara Warren briefly, but she appeared on the quarter, right? The American Women Quarter of 2 or 3 years ago, the first issuing of quarters that have significant women historical figures on them. And so as part of that, thinking about the public humanities, nothing more public than a quarter in your pocket, I did some presentations, and for a couple of outlets. One is called the Conversation, and this is sort of an open forum where people can engage with scholarly topics that we don't get into like the multiple footnotes. But that got me thinking, that sort of, and then it got adapted to a piece of curriculum that is out there free floating. But wouldn't it be amazing to have that curriculum be here and be able to be shared? I hope that is, you've definitely got my wheels turning, is what I will say, and thank you for that.
Well, thank you. And I know, Maria, you have your hand up, but I just wanted to point out spirituality with Agda, the importance of spirituality in the New Mexican population, and the influence, the fact that for thousands of years through the Native American culture, the spiritual practices, but more than 400 years, the Christianity, right? And the importance of that when it comes to treating patients, the fact that, you know, it's not necessarily going through Western medicine, but really acknowledging and recognizing the spiritual aspect of it with, you know, the novenas and the saints, etc. So thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
Hi, Anna. I have two questions and I put them in the chat. But first, I wanted to know, in today's sociopolitical context that promotes revisionist histories, right? How would you describe the urgency of preserving archival artifacts and documents, especially from colonial Southwest? And then my second question is, how can humanities scholars like us, right, doctoral students especially, continue to celebrate unheard and silenced voices through our research inquiries, given that context as well?
Well, those are wonderful questions. Thank you, Maria. Yeah, I mean, the urgency of preserving the archive, I always go back to that scene. I think it's probably Indiana Jones with like, it belongs in a museum, right? I want these things to be able to be referenced in a way that folks can see them, and hear them and experience them. I mean, one thing that I take, that I have taken many generations now of students to experience is to go and look at and touch and see these objects. Like, you can go get a copy of La Voz del Pueblo from 1920, the newsprint, you know, should probably wear gloves and open it up, like see what it was like to hold a broadside like that, you know, understand how the page was laid out, look at the advertisements. And then other forms as well. We have several folklorists in the audience, but you know, some of these audio recordings exist online, some of them exist on disc. So like thinking also about the oral format of these, but I think it's always urgent. Like, I can hear the urgency in the voices of the people who I study for preservation, to find a home, to make sure things are recorded, to make sure they're part of the record. And I I share that with them. I think probably marinating in it for the past 25 years makes me feel that urgency all the more, to make sure that those voices, those perspectives, those items, those artifacts are preserved. And then the second question, how can humanities scholars continue to celebrate unheard and silenced voices through research inquiries? It's such an important question. And I think the more we set the seeds of inquiry and show some pathways for how you can move these questions forward, the more we ask the next generation to do the same thing, right? I don't think, you know, I had really wonderful teachers and mentors early in my career who were like, try this, you know, give this a whirl and see where it takes you. I think a really important part of that is giving yourself the time and space to be able to explore these ideas, even when they take you down unexpected pathways. I remember distinctly being like in an archive in Spain and thinking I was going to find something, and I 100% did not. And I'd been there 2 weeks. And then all of a sudden I found the thing, and it was like, it was amazing. It was so incredibly frustrating. And then when you find the thing, you're like, wow, this opened up it was a bunch of shipping manifests, right? This is where, so like talking about humanistic research, like the things that get you excited are like, yeah, shipping manifests, tax records, but then making that into like, why is that important? Why is that interesting? Why is that compelling? That is how humanities scholars can continue to celebrate these voices, right? Like this shows that books were selling, that this nun's books were selling, that people were reading them, they were reading them in all these places, and they were sending the receipts back showing that they had read them. It's like, you know, collecting the old school library cards when you check out a book from the library. You know, like, look at all the people who have read this book. Well, there are people reading this book in like Ecuador. There's people reading this book in Peru. There's people reading the book in Argentina and in a bunch of different places in Mexico. And here's the receipts. Right. So like, it's very exciting. So I think that's one way.
No,
Ana,
Anna.
hello.
Hello.
It's Enrique La Madrid. I didn't see how to raise my hand, so I'd go like this. But on the topic of relicarios, I think I was telling you, I've got to get this one to you. This is a relicario that someone gave me. This guy from I don't know if he was from Zaragoza. I was at the repatriation event of the map that had been stolen from the map of Santa Fe that had been stolen from the Archivo Nacional de la Nación. And this guy came up and he said he realized he was looking for me. I gave him my card. He said he was going to write me. I don't even know his name, but he said this is from the las hermanas y madres concepcionistas para la gran investigadora de Nuevo Mexico. And he had forgotten your name, but I said, "Oh, you mean Ana Nogar? Great." And so he gave me that, and I said, "Oh, can I have a few more?" And he says, "No, these are really special. That is a tiny piece of her cloak, of the white part of her cloak, like off of the hem or something like that." So
Wow.
anyway,
Wow.
these things are popping up all over the place. This is a prayer card that he gave me to give you, and this is an amazing. It's called a triduo. A triduo. I've never heard of a triduo. It has some amazingly sophisticated prayers in there, not just the generic, prayers to Mary that you might find on little cards like this, but it is really amazing. It has some. They're praying to her. They're playing through her. I don't know if that's turning up backwards but probably so. But anyway, there's a little cover of it, and I'll get these to you as soon as possible because you never know when a new relicario is going to pop up, right? Directo de las hermanas y madres concepcionistas de Ágreda.
Thank you, Enrique. This is as I said before, she's kept me company for a long time, and we continue to keep each other company. And I can't wait to see this relicario. I can't wait to see this thing, and I can't wait to see what that triduo is all about, and see if it's the same one that was published in Mexico in the 1700s.
Mm-hmm. Gracias.
Gracias.
Felicidades.
Felicidades, Ana. I just wanted to congratulate you on this exciting work and really, showing the importance of the language, right? To do this recovery work and to understand much of our history is so crucial to understand the language that it's coming from, and you're a great example of working with that and then bringing it into the public, which thank you also to Francisco and Maria for their questions too, because it makes me very excited about the potential possibilities for if someone wanted to do a dissertation, for example, on setting up a curriculum of historical figures or there's so many ideas and possibilities for creating opportunities for graduate students that can then go into the public school system. So muchas gracias, Ana.
No, gracias a ti. Thank you to everyone for being here, for your wonderful questions. Carmela, Gabi, Enrique, Maria, I hope I didn't forget. Oh, Francisco, I really appreciate your questions. Again, they've got my wheels turning in these exciting directions. And thank you everyone for being here to support this talk.
Yes, thank you, everyone. And also and hopefully the big part of this is also building connections. People will be able to reach out to you and be able to share parts of their story with what you're doing. So thank you all. It's great to have you, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.
Gracias, adiós.
Thank you.